The Kizarn ships arrived without warning, massive monoliths of metallic dark gray that blotted out the sky. They hovered in the atmosphere, casting an eerie, unnatural shadow over cities, forests, oceans. Every corner of Earth felt their presence. The first contact was made through a simple, almost casual message broadcast to every television, radio, and digital screen on the planet. "We have come to elevate your species." The voice was smooth, commanding, and cold. It belonged to a being that introduced itself as Jolthor, a representative of the Kizarn, an ancient race that spanned galaxies. The message offered peace, an unconditional hand of guidance. To those who complied, the Kizarn promised unlimited resources, advanced technology, and the cessation of global conflict. To those who resisted, they implied the outcome would be less pleasant. Governments around the world scrambled to respond. Some, like President Natalie Harper of the United States and Chancellor Jacob Renner of the European Union, pushed back. There were talks of defense, of military retaliation, but no one had any real understanding of what they were up against. These ships weren't just alien. They were beyond human comprehension. Sleek, seemingly invulnerable to Earth's weapons, with technology far more advanced than anything humanity had ever dreamed of. Others, however, were more pragmatic. The Prime Minister of Japan, Shiro Tanaka, urged cooperation, pointing to the overwhelming might of the invaders. There were those who saw the arrival as a blessing, an opportunity for peace, prosperity, and a resolution to the wars that had ravaged Earth for centuries. These leaders and the population in their countries quickly swayed to the Kizarn's influence, eager to join what was being presented as an advanced galactic community. But in the United States, in places like New York and Los Angeles, a sense of defiance began to stir. On the streets, people shouted for independence, for sovereignty. Old men and women, who had lived through the wars of the 20th century, didn't trust alien overlords offering peace on their terms. The resistance wasn't organized at first. It was a series of small, scattered groups, some driven by fear, others by hatred of what they perceived as an invasion. The voices of defiance grew louder, more unified. Then, the Kizarn made their first move. Massive transports descended from the hovering ships, releasing thousands of strange, humanoid figures onto Earth's soil. They appeared peaceful, offering help to humanity's leaders, offering to uplift their societies. But as they began to integrate into human politics, they imposed their own laws and customs. Cities like Chicago and Berlin saw a sharp decline in civilian autonomy. The Kizarn promised peace, but their presence began to feel like an occupation. In New York, a viral video surfaced. Images of Kizarn soldiers confiscating food and medical supplies from local warehouses under the orders of a cold-eyed Kizarn leader named Velfar. The footage spread like wildfire, sparking protests, and soon a national debate. Was Earth's future to be decided by these alien overlords, or would humanity stand its ground? Jolthor's response was swift. Humanity will be elevated, or it will be erased. It was clear now. The Kizarn would not wait forever for humanity's submission. The clock was ticking. The Kizarn were patient, too patient, it seemed. For weeks, the world watched as Earth's leaders tried to navigate the delicate balance between cooperation and resistance. While some nations leaned toward compliance, hoping the Kizarn's promises were genuine, others, like the United States and Brazil, grew increasingly agitated. The public's mistrust was palpable, and the more the Kizarn helped, the more it felt like an invisible chain tightening around Earth's neck. But the aliens didn't seem to care about public opinion. They had come to Earth with one purpose: to test humanity. It started subtly. The Kizarn introduced their technology in stages, offering improvements in everything from medical care to energy production. They promised to end poverty, climate change, even human conflict, if only the people would accept their guidance. There were some who embraced the changes, thrilled by the possibilities, but others, those with longer memories, or simply more suspicion, watched as the Kizarn slowly began to pull the strings behind the scenes. Then came the tests. Thor, during one of his broadcasts, mentioned that humanity's true worth would be determined by its ability to endure trials set before them. "You must prove you are worthy of our gift," he declared, his voice calm but chillingly impersonal. The first test was a matter of survival. In remote regions across the globe, the Khazarn released their Gorak, terrifying biomechanical creatures designed for one purpose: to hunt and kill. They weren't sentient, just hunting machines, programmed to track human movement. For 1 week, thousands of people were scattered across uninhabited zones, forced to survive while the Khazarn watched from above. Some died. Many were injured, but it was the ones who survived that caught the attention of the Khazarn. They didn't cower. They fought. They adapted. In the American Midwest, a group of survivors, including a retired military surgeon named Jake Coleman and a young college student, Emily West, came together to form an impromptu team. They didn't have advanced weapons or even proper survival gear. They had to make do with whatever they could find: broken-down vehicles, scraps of metal, even the bones of the Gorak's earlier victims. But within hours, they had devised a rudimentary weapon that could take down the beasts. They didn't just survive. They fought back. Across the globe, similar stories emerged. In the jungles of South America, an indigenous tribe outsmarted the Gorak by setting complex traps. In Africa, a group of engineers used their knowledge of local terrain to create weapons from the environment itself. The Khazarn watched, intrigued. Humans were resourceful, clever, but there was something more: unstoppable. Back in their ships, Thor and his council were increasingly unsettled. The tests had been designed to break humanity. Instead, humans seemed to excel under pressure. The second test came soon after, this time, a psychological trial. The Khazarn forced whole cities to undergo social engineering experiments. Random selections of the population were relocated to new cities, each one being manipulated into hostile environments, pit against each other in orchestrated economic and social pressures. It was the ultimate game of control: create a crisis and see if humanity would tear itself apart. But instead of descending into chaos, people began to unite. The instinct for survival kicked in, not just for individuals, but for communities. Lawyers, teachers, farmers, engineers, people from all walks of life found ways to cooperate, to help each other, to restore order. Humanity showed an uncanny ability to adapt, innovate, and support each other in ways the Khazarn didn't foresee. And that's when the Khazarn began to realize something: humans didn't break. Every test, every challenge, only made them stronger. Thor's confidence started to crack. The Khazarn had expected submission, or at most, a slow collapse. Instead, they were witnessing a species that refused to give up. And that refusal to break, that was the thing that terrified them most. The Khazarn had underestimated humanity. They had come to Earth expecting a species to bend under their superior technology, to break under the weight of their invasions and manipulations. But as months passed, the Khazarn's tests only seemed to strengthen the humans' resolve. What was meant to be a quiet, gradual submission now looked like the beginning of something far more dangerous: a global resistance. Across the globe, small acts of defiance began to snowball. In Tokyo, underground factions formed, creating black market networks to counter Khazarn-imposed food and medical restrictions. In New Delhi, farmers sabotaged the aliens' bioengineering projects, using local crops to break Khazarn patents. And in Europe, former military leaders from multiple nations secretly coordinated attacks, launching surprise strikes on Khazarn supply lines. Each isolated incident was quickly growing into a collective pushback, an undeniable force. But it was in the heart of America that the real breaking point came. In the Midwestern United States, a sacred land, an ancient national park, was suddenly marked for harvesting. The Khazarn had identified it as a resource-rich site, perfect for mining the rare minerals required for their starships. This land wasn't just wilderness to Americans. It was a symbol of nature's power and the country's spirit. It was the land where the first settlers had built their homes, the place where families had gone for generations to connect with their roots. For most, it was sacred. When the Khazarn issued their mandate to begin stripping the land, protests broke out across the country. The American government, now heavily influenced by the Khazarn, insisted the destruction was a necessity for progress. But to the people of the United States, it was an unforgivable act of desecration. The outrage spread like wildfire. Activists, veterans, farmers, indigenous groups, all sectors of society joined together to protest the Khazarn occupation of the park. It wasn't just words that filled the air now. Resistance movements, now unified, began to strike back in force. Small, coordinated sabotage attacks crippled the Khazarn supply chains. Protests turned into full-fledged riots. Human ingenuity flourished as guerrilla tactics and old military strategies were revived. The Khazarn, who once viewed Earth's population as a disorganized and weak species, now found themselves battling an adversary they could not predict, a species that used everything at their disposal, from crude weapons to sophisticated hacking tools, to tear down the alien infrastructure. In Washington, President Natalie Harper, once a proponent of peaceful coexistence, faced mounting pressure. The public had made their decision. The moment of submission had passed. On the floor of Congress, Harper gave a passionate speech, calling for humanity's fight for self-determination. "The Earth is not theirs to take. We will not bow to these invaders," she declared. But it was in the streets that the world truly began to change. From the back alleys of cities to the mountaintops of remote regions, humanity came together, not as isolated groups, but as one. The Khazarn, for all their technology, could not comprehend the unshakable resolve that seemed to pulse from every corner of the globe. And in the shadows, the first sparks of a unified resistance began to form, led by those who had lived through war, those who understood the cost of freedom. But now, there was no going back. The Khazarn had pushed humanity too far, and Earth was no longer willing to be a passive participant in its own fate. The breaking point had come. And this time, the Khazarn would not be the ones setting the rules. By now, the Khazarn had realized the full scope of their mistake. What they had once seen as a peaceful world ripe for their domination had transformed into a battlefield, with humanity refusing to bend or submit. Each resistance attack grew bolder, more coordinated. Humans were not just surviving. They were becoming unpredictable, a force to be reckoned with. The time for subtlety was over. In cities around the world, bombings, cyberattacks, and acts of sabotage became increasingly frequent. But the true turning point came when a daring operation, planned by a shadowy coalition of resistance leaders, was set in motion. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about retaliation. Jake Coleman, a decorated war veteran turned resistance leader, stood in a makeshift command center beneath the streets of Chicago. His eyes were fixed on the map of the city, dotted with red and green markers, showing the locations of Khazarn outposts and human hideouts. Beside him, Emily West, a young hacker with a knack for cracking alien security systems, tapped at a console. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. They would strike at the heart of the Khazarn's operations in Chicago, using their knowledge of the city's infrastructure and the alien tech to their advantage. The target, a heavily guarded Khazarn comms relay, a key facility controlling most of the Khazarn's communication across North America. With it, they could cripple their command structure and throw a wrench into the Khazarn's centralized control over their forces. It was their chance to hit back at the heart of the occupation. A single successful strike could shake the invaders to their core. "We move tonight," Jake said, his voice gruff with determination. No hesitation. In and out. Emily nodded, her fingers flying over the console. "I've got the access codes. They won't see us coming." The Khazarn, despite their advanced technology, still relied on certain old-world systems that humans, with their ingenuity and unpredictability, had begun to exploit. Emily had managed to decrypt a weak link in their network, one that allowed them to bypass the alien security grid protecting the relay. The resistance would strike under the cover of darkness, using a combination of hacked Khazarn transport vehicles and underground routes to bypass enemy patrols. The city itself was an unholy mix of destruction and desperation. Most of Chicago's skyscrapers had been abandoned or repurposed as Khazarn supply depots, their once glistening glass towers now silent sentinels in an occupied world. As Jake and his team made their way to the target, the streets were eerily quiet, save for the hum of Khazarn patrols and the occasional explosion from a skirmish between humans and alien forces. They reached the relay station, an imposing fortress of steel and alien metal. But the humans had learned how to fight with what they had. Using improvised explosives and hand-built weapons, they breached the outer gates, triggering alarms that rang through the empty city streets. The Khazarn forces inside were caught off guard. The resistance had anticipated the alien tactics. This wasn't just a raid. It was a statement. Within minutes, the Khazarn were scrambling to respond, but they were slow, outnumbered, and disoriented by the guerrilla tactics humans had adopted. Jake and his team pressed on, cutting through the chaos with ruthless precision. Finally, they reached the heart of the comms relay. Emily worked quickly, planting the device that would disable the alien communications network. Just as the Khazarn reinforcements arrived, the last circuit was triggered, and the entire facility went dark. A wave of victory spread through the team, but the victory was short-lived. In the distance, the first of the Khazarn warships began to appear in the sky, heading straight for Chicago. Their victory had come at a cost. The Khazarn would not be caught off guard again. This was only the beginning. But the humans were ready. They had struck their first blow, and they were far from finished. The night the comms relay fell, humanity tasted the first real victory against the Khazarn. The destruction of the facility sent shockwaves through both Earth and the alien invaders. For the first time since the Khazarn arrived, Earth's resistance had delivered a crippling blow to the heart of the Khazarn's control network. The disruption spread quickly. Communications between their fleets were severed. Troop movements became disjointed, and the once unified occupation began to fray at the edges. But the Khazarn weren't going to sit idle. They retaliated with the same cold, calculated precision that had won them the initial advantage. Within hours, they launched full-scale offensives in multiple regions. Chicago, New York, Rio de Janeiro, and Berlin all became targets for their retribution. The Khazarn sent in elite strike teams to wipe out pockets of resistance, determined to crush any sign of human defiance. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, something unexpected was happening. Humanity's spark was growing. People weren't just running. They were rallying. The failure of the comms relay had shown the world that the Khazarn weren't invincible. If the resistance could hit their weakest point once, it could do it again. In cities across the globe, human forces began to organize, more formally, more strategically. No longer a loose collection of rebel factions, the resistance was turning into a global army. At the heart of this new wave of hope were two key figures, Jake Coleman and Emily West. Jake's military experience had earned him respect, but it was his ability to inspire and unite people that had made him the de facto leader of the resistance. Emily, on the other hand, was a technological prodigy, a hacker whose knowledge of Khazarn systems had made her the group's most valuable asset. Together, they were forming a coalition of human forces that spanned continents. But with this new momentum came a daunting realization. They were no longer just resisting. They were preparing for an all-out war. In the ruins of Chicago, Jake stood with Emily as they watched the city burn. The Khazarn had launched a retaliatory strike, leveling half of downtown in their attempt to quell the rebellion. "They think they can break us by burning our cities," Jake said grimly, his eyes scanning the horizon, where the smoke from the city's destruction still hung thick in the air. Emily shook her head. "It's not just the cities they're burning. It's the idea of us ever being free again. But we won't let them." Her voice was fierce, sharp with the kind of determination that Jake had seen in only a few other soldiers in his life, the kind of grit that never backed down. And as the Kizarn forces regrouped, there was a sense that the tide had started to turn. People in every corner of the world were getting the message. They had been pushed too far. The Kizarn might have the firepower, but humanity had something they hadn't counted on: an unrelenting will to fight for their future. The resistance, now more organized than ever, took a bold step forward. Jake and Emily, along with other leaders from around the globe, began formulating a plan to infiltrate the Kizarn's fleet itself. They would need to take the fight to the stars if they were to have any hope of winning. The first objective: to capture a Kizarn warship. The second: to turn their own technology against them. It was a daunting plan, but the odds no longer seemed impossible. For the first time since the invasion began, the humans felt the unmistakable spark of hope. They might not have been ready for the war they were about to face, but they had no intention of losing. The Kizarn had underestimated them before. Now, they would learn the true cost of underestimating humanity. The plan to infiltrate the Kizarn warship was a gamble, nothing less than the boldest move humanity had ever attempted. The Kizarn ships were impenetrable fortresses, designed not only for combat, but to ensure that no human could ever breach their technology. But in their arrogance, they had overlooked one thing: the humans who had nothing left to lose. Jake Coleman, Emily West, and their newly formed strike team spent weeks preparing for the mission. They had captured a small Kizarn shuttle during a recent raid, and Emily had spent countless hours reverse engineering the alien technology. What they discovered was staggering. The Kizarn ships weren't invulnerable, just extremely well defended. Beneath their powerful shields was a weak spot, a vulnerability in the ship's energy grid that could be exploited. Emily had identified it, but it would require direct access to the ship's central core. The problem: getting aboard without being vaporized by the Kizarn's defense systems. But the resistance was learning. They had learned to use the Kizarn's own tech against them. And now they had a plan. The mission was simple: infiltrate the Kizarn flagship, disable its systems, and plant an EMP device at the heart of the ship. If they succeeded, they would cripple the fleet, and perhaps for the first time, turn the tide of the war. The plan began with the theft of a Kizarn transport ship, which they would use to approach the flagship without raising alarms. The ship would be disguised with human-made camouflage, making it appear like a routine transport. Once inside the Kizarn fleet's outer defenses, they would strike fast, using every second of surprise to their advantage. The day of the mission, Emily's hands were steady but her mind raced. She had been in countless life-or-death situations, but this felt different. This was the moment they either won or lost everything. Jake, as always, exuded a calm determination. "We do this right, and we might just change everything," he said, checking the weapons strapped to his chest. The assault on the Kizarn flagship was a carefully orchestrated operation. As they neared the flagship, the Kizarn sensors detected the transport ship, but they misread the signal as a routine arrival. This mistake, this tiny lapse in judgment, was all the opening the humans needed. With the ship inside the flagship's docking bay, the team moved quickly, cutting through the alien corridors using tools they had stolen or adapted from the Kizarn's own arsenal. Once inside the heart of the ship, they were met with an unexpected challenge. The Kizarn's internal defenses weren't just physical, they were biological. The Kizarn had bioengineered soldiers, fierce and almost indestructible, bred specifically to protect their most critical assets. The humans fought tooth and nail, using every trick they had learned from years of resistance. Explosives, makeshift weapons, and even basic hand-to-hand combat helped them clear their way to the core. Emily's fingers flew over the ship's control panel, hacking into the Kizarn's encrypted systems. Her heart raced as alarms began blaring. The EMP device was set. "Jake, we need to move. Now," she shouted, pulling the trigger to activate the device. The explosion was deafening. The EMP sent a shockwave through the ship, cascading out in a pulse that disabled the flagship's entire network. The lights flickered, and the once dominant Kizarn warship went silent. The humans had done it. They had crippled the ship. But their victory was bittersweet. The ship wasn't dead. It was vulnerable. And the Kizarn would be coming. The resistance team had only minutes to escape. As they fled, the damage done to the flagship spread quickly through the fleet, causing chaos among the Kizarn. Ships began losing power, crashing into one another, unable to communicate with their command center. For the first time since the invasion began, the Kizarn were disorganized, scattered. Jake and his team barely made it back to Earth, their hearts pounding with the gravity of what they had achieved. The Kizarn were wounded, crippled in ways they hadn't anticipated, and for the first time, humanity had proven that it could stand toe-to-toe with their invaders, that they were capable of changing the course of the war. The battle was far from over, but the Kizarn were no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed. And humanity had just shown the universe what it could do when pushed to its limits. The victory aboard the Kizarn flagship reverberated through both the human resistance and the alien invaders. In the aftermath of the EMP strike, the Kizarn found themselves scrambling, their once mighty fleet in disarray. The crippling of the flagship had disrupted their command structure and shattered their ability to coordinate on a galactic scale. Ships that had once glided through the skies with chilling precision were now crippled or aimlessly floating in space, their power grids fried, their communication systems useless. But the Kizarn weren't a race to be underestimated. Though wounded, they were not broken. They were relentless, calculating, and now they were angry. In the weeks following the strike, the Kizarn launched a brutal counteroffensive. They deployed shock forces to Earth's surface, sending down fleets of invulnerable war machines and reinforcements to reclaim lost ground. Entire cities were razed to make an example of the humans' resistance. The world watched in horror as the Kizarn retaliated with terrifying speed, wiping out entire civilian populations in a bid to break the will of the human race. But instead of instilling fear, the violence only fueled the fire of resistance. The brutal crackdown served to unite the disparate human factions like nothing else had. People who had once been divided by national borders, by ideology, or by race now rallied together as one. Every Kizarn attack, every bombing raid, every mass slaughter only added more fuel to the fire. Earth had never seen such a unified struggle for survival, and the resistance wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for vengeance. In hidden bunkers, in makeshift war rooms beneath cities that still stood, the leaders of the global resistance were planning their next move. Jake Coleman and Emily West, now legends among the people, knew that this war could not be won on Earth alone. To truly defeat the Kizarn, humanity had to take the fight to the stars, to their home turf. They had their hands on alien technology, and now it was time to use it. The Kizarn warships were still scattered, but they weren't destroyed. The fleet, while disarrayed, still represented an immense threat. But the humans had learned from the first victory. They could use the Kizarn's own ships against them. Jake and Emily, along with a new generation of resistance leaders, began the long, perilous task of constructing a fleet, an actual human armada, made from salvaged Kizarn technology. Emily, using the knowledge she had gained from infiltrating the alien ship, reverse-engineered their systems, modifying them for human use. Earth's scientists, engineers worked tirelessly, repurposing Kizarn materials to build vessels capable of interstellar travel. The stakes were higher now than ever before. The Kizarn, though wounded, were coming for Earth with everything they had. Humanity, on the other hand, had taken its first steps into the stars, albeit with borrowed tech, but they were making progress. The new fleet, while small, was growing. It was an audacious move, an attempt to break free from the chains that the Kizarn had bound them with. The Kizarn would retaliate, but they didn't know that humanity had learned their methods, their tactics. The Resistance had begun to use the Khazar's strengths against them. Earth wasn't just a planet to conquer anymore. It was a battlefield, one that humans were now determined to win. For the first time in years, humanity could see the glimmer of hope in the distance. It wasn't just a dream of survival. It was a dream of victory. The time to fight back had come. And this time, humanity wasn't going to stop until the Khazar were no longer the conquerors, but the conquered. The stars had always been distant. For millennia, humanity had gazed up at them with wonder, longing, and dreams of what lay beyond. But now, the stars had become the stage of humanity's final stand. The war with the Khazar had blowed into the heavens, and Earth's fate hung in the balance. The human fleet, born from salvaged Khazar technology, had taken its first steps into deep space. What began as a handful of modified alien ships was now a small but formidable armada. Jake Coleman, Emily West, and their comrades had fought tooth and nail to assemble their forces, and now they were ready to strike the Khazar where they were most vulnerable, on their home turf. But the Khazar were prepared. Their homeworld, a fortress planet known as Viller, was the crown jewel of their empire, a planet wrapped in layers of advanced defenses, its atmosphere saturated with electromagnetic fields, and its surface guarded by legions of war machines. No one, not even the most optimistic of humans, thought they could simply walk in and take it. But it was Earth's last hope. Jake stood at the command deck of the newly christened human flagship, the Phoenix, gazing out at the dark void of space. Emily, ever the tactician, was at the helm, her fingers dancing across the console as she coordinated the fleet. They had trained for this day. But now, with the weight of everything they had fought for pressing down on them, Jake couldn't shake the sense that the moment had arrived, not just for their battle, but for their destiny. The Khazar had underestimated the resilience of humanity once, and they were about to learn that mistake again. The battle for Viller began in the blackness of space, as the human fleet emerged from the shadows of a nearby asteroid belt. The Khazar's defenses were formidable, dreadnought-class warships that could annihilate entire fleets with a single strike. But the human fleet had learned, adapted, and even turned some of the Khazar's technology against them. Emily had cracked the Khazar's encryption protocols, and for the first time, they had direct access to the Khazar's fleet-wide communications. It was a game-changer. The first wave was a surprise attack, a surgical strike to destabilize the Khazar's defensive lines. The human ships, now equipped with Khazar cloaking technology, slipped through the enemy's radar undetected, launching a barrage of missiles that tore through the Khazar's outer fleet like paper. The Khazar retaliated with overwhelming force, but they were unprepared for the human tactics that had evolved during the war. Guerrilla tactics in space, hit-and-run strikes, feints, and ambushes. For every Khazar dreadnought that fell, another human vessel rose to take its place. But the true test came when Jake, Emily, and the core of the resistance force breached the Khazar's outer atmosphere, entering the planetary defense grid. Viller was an impenetrable stronghold, but Emily had found a weakness, a blind spot in the Khazar's defense network. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Using stolen Khazar tech, they hacked into the planetary shields, opening a narrow gap for the human fleet to enter. Inside the atmosphere, the final battle began in earnest. The skies of Viller were a churning storm of laser fire, explosions, and chaos. Jake's flagship, the Phoenix led the charge, leading a direct assault on the Khazar's central command center. It was a suicide mission, one that even the bravest of soldiers knew might end in their deaths. But they had no choice. Humanity was all in. As they neared the Khazar capital, the human fleet faced its deadliest opponent. A Khazar war titan, a towering behemoth of technology and destruction, towering over the battlefield like a dark god. The last, desperate line of defense for Viller. But humanity had learned from their struggles. They were no longer the helpless prey. With a combination of brute force and cunning, Jake and his crew launched a final, coordinated strike. Missiles, drones, and EMP pulses exploded in perfect synchrony, overwhelming the Titan's defenses. With one final, earth-shattering explosion, the Khazarn War Titan collapsed, and the human fleet surged forward, breaking through the remaining Khazarn defenses. They had done it. Viller, once the heart of the Khazarn Empire, fell. Humanity had won. The aftermath was a silence unlike anything Earth had ever known. The Khazarn were not gone, far from it, but their empire was in ruins. The war was over, and the invaders had been forced to retreat, their once unassailable forces now scattered and broken. The humans stood victorious, but the cost was great. Millions had died. Cities had fallen. But in that final battle, humanity had proved that no force, no matter how advanced or powerful, could break their spirit. They had fought for their future, for their freedom, and for their place in the stars. The world would never forget the day humans finally snapped, and neither would the universe.